Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this, which is the last session on Family Mediation Week. I hope everyone's had a good week and enjoyed all of the sessions that have been going on. It's great to have you all with us, and thank you for sticking with us to Friday of Family Mediation Week. As you can see on the screen there, so today we are going to be talking about a thorny issue, which is considerations for mediation where there are issues of domestic abuse. This session is being recorded, so if you're not able to stay for the whole session, then you can look at the website on the FMC. The details are on the screen, and you'll be able to find this webinar and all of the other webinars from Family Mediation Week on there. So please do check that out and find lots of great resources available as well. Okay, so in terms of today, just wanted to start by introducing the speakers, which is myself and Karen Kipping, who you'll be able to see hopefully on the screen. Absolutely delighted to introduce Karen. So Karen is one of the UK's leading divorce coaches, and she's also a domestic abuse specialist. So I imagine quite a lot of people joining us already know who Karen is in the work that she does with family law as well. She's been working in the sector for, I think it's something like over 16 years, you were telling me, Karen.
Yep.
Supporting men and women who are recovering from abusive relationships. Karen is also an independent domestic violence advocate, and so she'll be supporting clients when they're appearing in family courts in that role, and will be advocating for them in safeguarding processes. And she has an in-depth knowledge in this area so that she can ensure that the clients feel safe and supported when they're going through separation and divorce. Karen is also very familiar with the mediation process, and indeed she trains mediators on domestic abuse. So she is passionate about helping people through different processes such as mediation, and certainly is a big fan, I think it's fair to say, Karen, of mediation processes as well. So it's fair to say that Karen's very much an expert in this area. Lots of knowledge that she can impart on us all today and help with mediation where there are issues of domestic abuse. Turning to myself, so my name is Paul Linsall. I head up the family team at Boys Turner in Reading. I am a mediator. I'm fully accredited. I've been a mediator for just over 10 years. I'm able to do MIAMS, able to do the mediation voucher scheme, and I'm also a hybrid mediator as well, so I can operate in that way. I'm also one of only 7 lawyers in the Thames Valley region, recognised in Chambers and Partners for their work in ADR in family law, of course, of which mediation is one element of that. So that's who we are. In terms of today, so domestic abuse in mediation, obviously it's quite a challenging topic, and we certainly know that there's a lot of differing views, both within the mediation world and family law in general, as to how to deal with these issues. So we thought what we'd want to do at the outset is just kind of gauge what people in the room think. We can see there's quite a good number of people in the room taking part today. So we just wanted to run a poll right at the outset and say we've got a question here for you, which is, should mediation take place when there is a history of domestic abuse? So hopefully Helen, who's on the call, is going to start the poll now. And if you can all access that, and you've got 3 options to choose from. So either yes, mediation should take place where there's a history of domestic abuse, no, mediation shouldn't take place, or unsure. And we'll just leave that poll running for a few moments and start to gauge what the people in the room generally are feeling at this stage on that. Lots of people answering that. That's great. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll just run that for a few more seconds. If there's anyone else that wants to fill in the poll, then please do so now. Okay, I think we've got most people have answered that at this stage. So Helen, perhaps if we could close that poll, and then hopefully people will be able to see the results there as well. So just to run through those results, if you're unable to see them. So answering yes, mediation should take place, we've got 27% of people saying yes, 11% of people saying no, mediation shouldn't take place where there's been a history of domestic abuse. And it's fair to say clear winner on the poll, which is probably good news, Karen, for you and I doing the talk today. That's why people are here. Unsure. So unsure whether mediation perhaps should be taking place if there's issues of domestic abuse or a history of domestic abuse. Okay, so that's obviously why we're here. And I think, again, that poll's pretty clear that it's a bit of a grey area. And I can see there's a few comments in the chat as well about it depends. So that's what we're really going to talk about today. So you'll see on the screen our agenda, and what we're going to go through here is what is domestic abuse. So again, a bit more of an overview. We'll sort of run through that fairly quickly. We're then going to look at screening for domestic abuse. We'll then be answering the question about should mediation be taking place. We'll then be talking about, or certainly Karen will be talking about what mediation is feeling like for those that are victims of abuse, and then some information about how we get this right in mediation, some top tips, and then there will be an opportunity for questions and answer at the end as well. The Q&A box will be open throughout, so if you've got any questions as we're going through, please feel free to put them in there, and then we'll try to pick those up at the end if we've got time at the end as well. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Karen to talk about some facts about domestic abuse. Karen.
Sure, thank you, Paul. It was really interesting to see that poll at the beginning, actually. I thought that's where most people would sit, with the unsure, because, yeah, it's a difficult one. So let's just look at the facts to start off with. So at the moment, we have 80,000 children that are caught up within the family court system. You know, 1 in 3 children that are living with divorce. That is a lot of children that are caught up in these very difficult and long-winded processes, and a lot of, you know, acrimonious, quite often, processes. And 30 women attempt suicide as a result, a direct result of experiencing domestic abuse. Every week, 3 women take their own lives. So we have an increasing rate of suicide year on year. And I'm sure, knowing all of my clients that I support are experiencing post-separation abuse, that some of that, at least, is due to this ongoing trauma, ongoing stress, ongoing litigation. You know, it causes so much pressure and stress on somebody who is actually trying to recover from domestic abuse. 95% of domestic abuse cases involve economic and financial abuse. That's a definite thread that runs throughout the coercive control. And there is a higher incidence of domestic abuse amongst those who have separated, followed then by those who are divorced or single. So, you know, we are seeing the long-term impact of domestic abuse. We are seeing the long-term negative impact of the processes that we've had traditionally. And it's not easy. It's not easy to get yourself out of an abusive relationship in the first place. And then once you're out of it, it's still then very, very difficult. And the current legal processes don't always help. They don't always take into account the coercive control. And it's just very, very difficult. And then we go back to the Harm Report 2020, which hopefully you are all aware of, which looked at the family courts, which looked at the impact and looked at what changes need to be made and the recommendations from the Harm Report. And still some of those have to be implemented. You know, we are still nowhere near, you know, where we need to be in terms of supporting victims of domestic abuse after separation. Divorce is at a 10-year high. You know, everybody knows somebody who's divorced or going through divorce or has been divorced. So we've got to get better at helping people. We've got to find new ways, and we've got to improve on the ways that we have already to help them. So when we're talking about domestic abuse, there is a statutory definition for domestic abuse, and that is that it's any incident or pattern of incidents, and it can involve, but isn't limited to, all of these behaviours. So we're talking about psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, emotional abuse, violent, threatening behaviour, controlling, coercive behaviour. So it's a pattern, and it's not always physical. Very often the coercive control, the subtle stuff that runs throughout the relationship is very subtle. So you might have people in front of you who actually don't see themselves as victims of domestic abuse because it's not physical, because they don't feel that it's bad enough. It is a gender neutral definition of domestic abuse. We know that domestic abuse happens to men as well as women. I have several male clients at the moment who have been physically and coercively abused by their spouses. And just to look at some of the economic abuse specifically, because this is something that you might come across, it can include things like having sole control of the family income, preventing the victim from claiming welfare benefits. It might be interfering with their education, training, or employment, not allowing them or controlling their access to communication, to transport, utilities, food. So it's about isolating them from sources of support. Could be damage to a victim's property. So there are lots and lots of examples under each of these headings, which unfortunately we don't have time to go into everything today. But if you just look on the Women's Aid website, if you just look at domestic abuse platforms, they will give you all of those things that underpin these main headings. And it is a real subtle, coercive, controlling pattern of behavior, which really means that somebody is dependent on the other person. The victim is totally dependent on the other person. They have no voice, they have no say, and it can be very frightening even when there's no physical abuse.
Okay, so that's a quick overview of what domestic abuse is, and I think the summary for me is obviously it's quite wide-ranging now. The definition's expanded. There's a lot to be thinking about, and I think as a mediator, you've got to be really aware of all of this stuff. And obviously, then we're looking at the importance of then screening for domestic abuse in our role as mediators to make sure we're aware of this. So just wanted to sort of spend a little bit of time now explaining why are we doing this? Why is this so important? I think the first point to make is that there is a risk when you're entering into or considering entering into a mediation process that if there are issues of abuse, well, this process might be used to further that abuse. If you've got a perpetrator of abuse, they might be looking at mediation as a further way, particularly with elements of control, to try and control the situation further. They might see mediation as a bit of an easy option. So it's really important that we're screening for that and we're not becoming a tool effectively for that abusive behavior. So that's the first thing. The next thing is if there is elements of abuse and we're not alert to it, you've got a risk of poor outcomes in mediation. So if you proceed and you don't know that that's what's going on, you might not be aware if you haven't screened properly that there's a dynamic within the parties, and therefore there might be undue influence. There might be people making concessions that they're making for reasons that you haven't understood, and so you're not necessarily getting to the outcomes that you should be getting to in mediation. You're not giving people that opportunity to be empowered, to take control of their own destiny and to make decisions in an informed manner, because you haven't addressed the fact that there's abusive behaviours that are going on. Next one, and I think this is a really big one as a mediator, is you have that worry that if you haven't screened it properly, you could suddenly be losing control of the process. I think particularly now, more and more of us mediators are doing mediation online. Having sort of physical control of the room, as it were, is harder, I think, when you're online. And we'll talk about some of the adaptations a bit more in a moment, but it's something, again, you need to be aware. You need to have screened for domestic abuse so that you can ensure that you can keep control of the process if you are going to proceed with the mediation. And complaints. Put bluntly, if you move forward with a process and you haven't screened properly for abuse, and then something, heaven forbid, goes wrong, in a mediation process. I mean, it doesn't bear thinking about at the most extreme ends of what it could go wrong with, but even at sort of more mild issues that might arise, you might be then subject to complaints. You might have set up a process in a way that is not appropriate, and has caused someone to be put in a position that they should not have been put in, and then you risk complaints as a result of that. So again, it's something we need to be really tackling head on. You can't just bury your head in the sand. You need to be dealing with this stuff. And then, of course, we are in Family Mediation Week and the FMC, and I hope all mediators, whether you are subscribed through the FMC or not, are at least aware of the code of practice. We have to screen. It's something we're told we must do. And I think just to sort of break that down a bit more, we have to be alert to the fact that there could be power imbalances in a relationship between the participants in mediation. So really, we need to be looking out for that and screening for that right at the outset. And again, it's all within the code. Those power imbalances could be as a result of abuse, but also it's referencing manipulation, coercion, controlling behavior. So it's not just looking for physical abuse or verbal abuse. It's the full definition of what's coming into that spectrum of abuse. So really important to be screening for all of that. And then, as I say, it's basically saying in the code that we must do a screening process, and we're looking for not just abuse, but fear of abuse and any harm, and whether it's towards one of the parties or towards a child. And I think, again, that's an important point to note. As part of the screening process, you're looking more broadly at this and thinking about who else is involved in the family. And that's all then included within the MIAM standards. So the MIAM really is the big opportunity for the screening. Obviously, you're having a confidential discussion with each party, and you should be asking questions to undertake that screening process and really go through with them all of that. And it's important then to make sure that your MIAM is compliant to allow you that opportunity to screen properly. And again, we've got on the screen there the reference to the MIAM standards. So the mediator has an obligation to create an environment where they can essentially do this screening and undertake these questions and exploration really into what's going on in a meaningful way. And again, I refer you to the MIAM standards, all can be found on the FMC website. So you've got to do it. You've got to demonstrate that you've done that. So you need to be recording it and recording that you're delivering a safe service as well. So really important stuff. And I'm going to hand back to Karen now to talk a little bit more about how we can try and do that in a more meaningful way. So Karen, we're going to look at some questions that you can ask when screening for domestic abuse. You're on mute, Karen.
I was trying to be clever and mute myself in between. Yeah, it is really important to think about the questions that you can ask, because you're trying to tease out information. You know, the client that's in front of you might not know how to explain their situation. They might not know how to articulate what they're frightened of. Like I was saying before, many people don't see themselves as victims of domestic abuse. They don't recognize financial abuse. They don't always recognize emotional abuse, particularly if they've been in that relationship for many years and it's just become very normal to them. Or they can go to the other end of the spectrum, and they will just want to vomit it all out in a MIAM and tell you their whole life history. So you might have to gain the trust and tease out bits of information, or you might have to kind of filter through everything that they're telling you to get the relevant bits of information that you need to know. So ways that you can encourage them to disclose that information, through questions, open questions. How was your relationship before you separated? What was the reason for the breakup? Was it amicable? Was it not? Whose decision was it? How do you feel about mediation with your ex is a very kind of clear and simple question. Lots of people are obviously going to be anxious about mediating with their ex-partner for whatever reason, they've separated. Divorce is always emotional and difficult. But if you've got somebody that is frightened about saying what they really think in front of that person, you know, that's got to be taken into consideration. And we have to remember also that lots of people, unfortunately, are still living together whilst they're going through mediation, whilst they're going through divorce, because they maybe just can't afford to live separately. So you've got to be really mindful that that person might be going back home to the person that's been abusing them. So yeah, has your ex ever made any threats towards you or your children? And you might have to expand on that a little bit, because they might think, oh no, you know, he's never threatened to shoot me or stab me or hurt me or whatever. Oh no, he'd never do that. But he might have threatened to make sure that you don't get as much time with the children. He might have threatened you with financial abuse. Again, it's kind of giving that explanation to help people understand that those things are still threats. You know, they might have threatened suicide. That's quite a common threat. You know, if you divorce me, for example. And you want to know why they're in mediation. You know, what are they trying to achieve? What do they want to get out of it? What do you think might happen if you don't agree with something in mediation? What's your ex's reaction likely to be? Are they the type of person that gets angry? Do they sulk? Do they, you know, are you fearful of their reaction? Are you concerned about your safety? You definitely need to know that. What are you worried that they might do? Has there been any police, social care, women's aid type involvement? And then what's the worst thing that's happened with your ex? That can be a really good kind of leading question. You know, really think about what's the worst thing, because like I was saying before, abuse can become very normalized in a relationship. And sometimes even things like, you know, choking and strangulation, people can forget about those things when they've become part of that abusive behavior, or maybe it happened a long time ago, but it's actually still a very, very relevant risk if somebody feels like they're losing control. So what are their biggest fears? And importantly, what support do they have in place? You need to know how vulnerable this person is. So, you know, you can ask these questions before the mediation session. So somebody's got time to think about it. They might find it easier to, you know, to say things in the MIAM if they've had a chance to think about it, rather than thinking on the spot. When somebody is in quite a traumatic state, they can have what you call brain fog. So it means that it's really difficult for them to process information, and it's really difficult for them to articulate how they feel. It's a bit like everything's happening in slow motion. So sometimes just giving them a few questions before the session can just give them that extra bit of time that they need to just really kind of think about what they want to say.
Karen, just to jump in there, because that's something you and I have talked about a few times in terms of how to make the MIAM suitable. And again, it goes back to that MIAM standard point about creating the right conditions for people to be able to talk about these things and to explore it. And the reality is, in a MIAM, the mediator is often throwing a lot of information at someone, and to take all of that on board in any circumstances, regardless of whether there's abuse present or not, is difficult. So we've sort of spoken about how it would be important to actually be asking some of these questions in advance, so people have got time to kind of process them in their own minds and think on them a little bit, and then have the discussion about it, not just sort of firing questions in a, okay, we've got an hour MIAM, let's get through the MIAM quickly, and okay, we've ticked that. It's not a tick box point. This is really meaningful questioning and sort of exploring this carefully. Do you think that's the right way to sort of approach this with people?
Definitely. And, you know, the more time they can have to process information and to really understand what they want to say and what you're trying to achieve as well, then, you know, that's going to set them off on the right footing, really, with the mediation. They want to know that you understand what it's like for them, right? That's their one chance in a MIAM to tell you what their life has been like and what they want potentially out of mediation and what they're struggling with, really.
Yeah, and I can see, we'll come to obviously questions at the end of the discussion as well in more detail, but I can see some questions in the Q&A about this. I think the way I tend to set this up is I'll be getting participants to fill in a preliminary information form before a MIAM, so you're not going in cold with no information about what's going on. And within that preliminary information form, you can build in some of these questions as well. Karen, just to get your views on it though, in terms of sort of asking that up front and sort of in advance, is there a risk that if there is an abusive relationship, that if you're sending that to both parties, for example, because they both might be coming in for their separate MIAMs, that obviously they'll be seeing the questions that are being asked and there may be some influence going on, that sort of manipulative behavior behind the scenes? Oh, you mustn't tell them this, you mustn't tell them that. Do you think that's a risk, or do you think actually that's not something that would prevent you from sending it out in advance?
As long as you check that they've got a separate email address that is not linked to the ex, and most people generally do understand that it's a good idea to have a separate email. All of my clients have separate emails that are set up. That's one of the first things that we do to make sure that anything that is confidential is not going to be linked to their ex. They're not going to know any passwords and things like that. So yeah, you do have to be careful. And just make sure that they've got that kind of safety net.
And I think, again, to just sort of add my thoughts on that, I think the way I would suggest it's done is some of these questions, which are perhaps much more direct, where you're sort of saying, have you got concerns about their behavior, things like that. They're probably not necessarily the ones to ask up front. The sort of broader questions, what are you worried about? What are these? You can sort of tease things out in that way. I think they're the ones that I would suggest are asked up front, rather than sort of direct, almost slightly accusations in it, sort of questions. I wouldn't be suggesting you ask those up front.
Yeah. Okay. Or you could even put those questions, some of the questions, to the client in advance and say, you don't have to answer them on email, but these are just some of the questions that we're going to be discussing in the session. So it's just to get them thinking.
And you're going to talk a little bit more as well about some of the specific things to be really on alert for when we're doing screening now. So the sort of real high risk factors.
Yeah, so we've spoken about coercive control being that subtle behavior that kind of feeds through a relationship. For most people, if there's going to be physical abuse, that tends to come much later. It comes much further on, if it happens at all. But for every abusive relationship, there's always coercive control. The fact that there's no physical abuse does not mean that that person is safe. Okay, so that's really important to remember. And separation is one of those trigger points for an escalation of abuse, because somebody feels like they're really losing control. The person is going to leave them that they never thought was going to leave them. And so that's comes as a real shock to them, even if they've threatened many times to leave. They're always going to feel like it's a real shock and they've completely lost control. So that quite often can mean their behavior gets worse. So separation is definitely a trigger point. If your client tells you that they've been held around the throat, if they've been choked, if maybe they just flippantly say it, with their story and what they're talking about, it's very dangerous. We have the criminal offence now of non-fatal strangulation for a reason. It is very, very dangerous. And if somebody is saying that they have been strangled, they have been choked, they couldn't breathe, they've been suffocated, that is very dangerous, and we have to take that seriously when we're looking at safety. So conflict over child contact, again, if they're coming to mediation, it may be for child arrangements because they don't agree. There is that conflict around the children, and we know that children get hurt when there's conflict. We know that with child arrangements, unfortunately, some children end up losing their lives, as a result of contact being stopped and that perpetrator feeling like they've completely lost everything. So again, when we're looking at child contact arrangements, we've got to make sure that they are safe and that they are in the children's best interest. So isolation naturally happens within an abusive relationship. That victim is naturally isolated. That's one of the key tactics that perpetrators use. So how vulnerable is that person? Do they have any support network around them at all? You know, are there any issues around religion and community where they feel completely ostracized from that community? Is that an issue that you need to be mindful of? And threats of homicide and suicide, again, very, very common. When somebody feels like they're completely losing control, the relationship is ended, you know, they'll say, well, I'm going to kill you if you leave me, or I'm going to kill myself if you leave me. They don't always mean it, but you know, if there are credible threats, if that person has had a history of suicide, of depression, of mental health issues, alcohol abuse, that kind of thing, you know, again, we've got to take it seriously. And use of weapons. Weapons are very easy to get hold of these days. You know, firearms. I've got several clients who've got firearms, and they might have firearms because they, you know, shoot pheasants or whatever. But, you know, in the wrong hands, they're obviously very dangerous. Escalation. So if your client is saying, actually, the behavior has been getting worse, I am starting to feel really frightened because the temper is flaring, you know, they're punching the walls, or, you know, I just feel this sense that things are really kind of escalating. Again, we have to take that seriously because they know that person better than anybody else. Pregnancy, again, another tipping point for escalation, because that person is no longer number one. They're number two. There's a lot of jealousy involved, a lot more professionals getting involved, and the dynamic of the relationship changes. Stalking is very obsessive behavior, and that can be stalking through tech. You know, I have lots of clients who are being stalked through tech devices, listening devices in the home. Again, you've got to think about that in terms of safety. Physical injury obviously is an obvious one. If somebody has physically hurt you before, there's always that potential for it to happen again. Previous criminal history, you know how difficult it is to get somebody convicted of anything these days. If they've been in prison before, they're probably the type of person that isn't going to be too worried about going back to prison. And economic and financial abuse, again, it's about that power dynamic, isn't it, in the relationship? If somebody has never had access to their own money, somebody is, you know, threatening to really punish them by making them homeless and that kind of thing. It's showing that intention and that power and that control. Now, all of these things are what we call high-risk indicators. And when we talk about high-risk indicators, we're talking about harm, like serious, imminent harm to somebody. But they have to come with other things as well. It's like a triad, a combination, what we call the homicide triad. So any of those risk factors, those significant high-risk factors, with a trigger point, such as separation, combined with a controlling personality. So if you have all those three things together, that spells danger, okay? So these things are just the key things really to be mindful of. And if you're hearing any of that, then absolutely you need to really encourage that client to get specialist help from somebody like myself or somebody like a domestic abuse organisation, so we can do some really proper safety planning.
Thanks, Karen. And I think that's it, isn't it? I think usually this is the MIAM where you're sort of dealing with this. And I think the way I tend to approach it these days is to almost have this list as a sort of checklist as you're going through. And if you are sort of ticking some of these and thinking, hang on, yeah, there are some of these higher risk factors, you're escalating this to a higher thought process as part of the MIAM. This is something we really, really need to be dealing with seriously. And it may be that you get someone like yourself or another independent domestic violence advocate or another specialist to come in and to sort of help with that assessment. And something I've done in the past is to get get specialist input into, can we proceed? Can we actually move this forward? Or can we just do a bit more in terms of the screening process here, a bit more expertise coming in to understand what those risks are, not just for the process, but also for the individual. I mean, again, we should be signposting. That's something we have to be doing as mediators. So I think it's really important to be aware of these things. And I think, again, top tip for any mediators watching this is just have that list to hand, so that you know if there are some of these things coming up that you do need to be thinking even harder on this. Because I think, again, it's fair to say when you're doing the screening, domestic abuse is a spectrum. It's something which it's very hard to sort of say, okay, we've identified there's some element of domestic abuse. Okay, we're going to pull the shutters down. We can't mediate. That's not what we're saying. But where there are certain things that are more serious or higher risk, that's where we need to be thinking a bit more on this. Okay, we're going to move on. So obviously what we've talked about so far is screening for domestic abuse and identifying where there is abuse. Sort of started talking about it there, but really, what do you do? Okay, you've done your MIAM, for example. What do you do in order to move things forward if you have identified, and as I said before, it could be a spectrum of abuse, but you have identified some abuse. First thing, obviously, to consider is safety. And I think it probably goes without saying, but you've got to make sure everyone is safe. And I think that applies to the participants, but also to you as the mediator. You've got to be thinking about this, and can you proceed in a safe manner? If you can't, if it's unsafe to do that, then you shouldn't be proceeding, I think is the short answer. So I think it's very clear in terms of the obligations as the mediator that you shouldn't be progressing with this if it's going to be unsafe. We have an obligation to prevent threatening or intimidating behaviour by a participant during a mediation. Are we going to be able to do that? Which then moves on to the sort of next consideration. So if you think there may be the way forward with this that's in a safe manner, and again, you may have needed to get some expert input for the individual to help them with their assessment of that. It's then looking at, well, how do we adapt the process? How can we make this process built around the fact that there are these dynamics in place? And you'll see on the screen there that there's three things to sort of throw out as suggestions, I suppose. The first is shuttle mediation. And again, I think most people are probably familiar with that, but just to explain that very briefly, shuttle mediation is where the two participants are never actually in contact with one another during the mediation process itself. So it could be that they're in separate rooms in a physical mediation, and the mediator is shuttling between those two rooms, and you would have put things in place for coming to the session and leaving the session so that there's staggered start times, staggered end times, and things to manage that as well. You could be doing it remotely, and so that they're on separate calls and they're never speaking to one another. And again, you could manage that in certain ways. You'd make sure that they're in different locations, they're not anywhere near each other during that. Or it could be entirely separate sessions. So you could be meeting with one party on one day and the other party on a completely separate day, so that they've got that physical break between them in the shuttle format. The other thing you'll see on screen there is then hybrid mediation. And I think it's important to explain what hybrid mediation is. Essentially, the key significance of hybrid mediation is that as the mediator, you can hold a confidence between the parties. And I think particularly with the sort of domestic abuse situations, this is something that can be really valuable because it allows the parties to be more open with you as the mediator and to express things that they don't necessarily want to be expressed to the other person. So for example, if you've got a victim of abuse, they might be saying to you, I'm really scared about something. I'm really worried if I say this, that this is going to be the response. And you as the mediator can hold that as a confidence and not necessarily have to share that with the other party. So again, it can be something that can really help that process move forward in that way. And then the third thing on screen there is third-party support within the process. So I think, again, it's important to note that some people, if there are these situations of abusive behaviour, they're going to find this process harder if you're going to move forward with it. Karen was alluding to it a bit earlier, and we'll talk about it a bit more in a moment, about what people are feeling as they're going through mediation. But certainly you can help with that by adapting the process, having a third party present. Now, that could be a lawyer, it could be a domestic abuse coach, such as Karen, or a professional in domestic abuse. It could just be a friend. Obviously, you'd have to get agreement to that within the process, so the other party would have to be aware that was going to be happening. But again, that might be something that you could set up to make that process more effective in terms of adaptations. Something else to think about, obviously, if you have identified issues of abuse, is not just what's going to be happening in the mediation sessions themselves, but what's going to be happening outside of the mediation space. You need to know, are these people still living together? Are they interacting? Are there any injunctions in place? What's the sort of situation outside of the mediation space? So you've got to be managing those risks as much as you're managing the risks inside the mediation itself. And again, it's something you'd be talking through with both parties, but particularly the alleged victim or the victim of abuse, to understand what concerns they may have. Because if you get onto a thorny issue in mediation, what's going to happen once that mediation session finishes? And you might be seeing them for another week or 2 weeks or however long it might be. So you need to be thinking about that very carefully as well. And then signposting. So again, it's really important to, as I mentioned before, signpost to additional support. It's part of the MIAM standards as well, but that's something we should be doing. So if you are aware of issues of abuse or alleged abuse, or even people not sure whether they are victims of abuse or not, you should be signposting them to appropriate resources, whether that's, again, professionals like Karen, whether it's charities or other resources that are in your area. Costs for the client. So you've got to be realistic. I think, again, this is an important one. So when you are dealing with this, you've got to be alert to the fact of the wider circumstances of the individual situation, because it's all well and good saying, no, you can't mediate, there's issues of abuse, you need to go and sort this out elsewhere. And you might be thinking, okay, court processes, or you might be thinking something else. And obviously, as part of the MIAM, you should be going through all of those different processes with the individual as well. But you need to understand what their financial circumstances are. How are they going to get these issues resolved? How are they going to find conclusions in these? Because just because there's issues of abuse, the complexities of sorting out children arrangements, the complexities of sorting out finances, they may actually be even harder, but they still need to be addressed. So how are they going to do that? What space is going to be used for that? How is the costs going to work in that as well? You've got to help them understand what the mediation process obviously would cost, as well as what some of those other processes might cost, particularly if there are issues of economic abuse and financial abuse. That's something you're going to have to really be managing very, very carefully to understand how this is all going to fit together for them. It may be that they need to take some external support and advice first. The next thing is to mention is that, okay, you've done your screening at the outset, but that's not the only time that you do it. Obviously, that's an ongoing obligation throughout the process. You've got to be considering that all the way through the mediation. You've got to be considering whether the mediation is actually making any progress. What can you do to move things forward? What's getting in the way? Is it these behaviours that are getting in the way? And so on. So how can you encourage that process along? And really, I think what it comes down to, I think for a lot of people, and I think this probably goes back to the poll that we ran at the start, which is effectively, where do you draw that line in the sand? At what point do you say, okay, this is something that, yes, we can proceed with as long as we make certain adaptations? At what point do you say, no, it's not? And if a mediation is going forward, is there certain things where you go, actually, no, we're now going to call a halt to it, or no, we can carry on? And Karen, I don't know your views, but I think certainly my view on that is that it's probably for the individual mediator to think on that. And some mediators, perhaps if you're more experienced, perhaps if you're used to working with other professionals as well, you might be a bit more confident to take on this sort of work and to assist people and put adaptations in place and so on. Other mediators, you might think, actually, no, I'm not at that stage yet. I don't want to go down that route yet. Just asking you a question, Karen, and perhaps a little bit unfair because we didn't rehearse this, but in terms of drawing that line in the sand, do you have any thoughts as to where you would draw it?
It is very individual because each person knows how much they can cope with. So it is again, getting them to reflect on, is it making progress? You know, is there a way that you can try and move it forward? Or is your ex completely not in the mood for negotiating, just using it as a tick box, just using it as a platform to try and criticize and belittle you? You know, can we look at any other options to move it forward? Or can we maybe perhaps, you know, do a bit of preparation before the next mediation session, or a bit of coaching to try and get you in a more confident mindset, to be really clear about what you're willing to agree to and not agree to, and where there might be some wiggle room. You know, sometimes they need to have a bit of a debrief with myself between sessions, to really think about how to go into the next session, how to prepare, and, you know, and what they can expect next time. So I might not get, you know, I don't really kind of get involved in the mediation as such, but it's helping them get in the right mindset for it sometimes. But sometimes they do call it a day and they say, actually, I just can't do it anymore. I just, you know, it's not working.
And I think that's it. And I think, I mean, again, the last point on that slide of what's the alternative, I think it's a really important point as well, because a lot of people, I mean, I hear a lot of mediators as well, so saying, "Oh no, we can't do it." And I understand that, and I understand the reasons why certain people perhaps feel that way. But equally, that doesn't necessarily move things forward for that individual. They've still got that circumstance, and actually, what's going to really benefit them is getting out of that and moving forward with their lives, and moving forward through some of these issues they need to address. So thinking about what's the alternative, because let's face it, none of these processes are going to be great for them. Okay, I'm conscious of time. We need to sort of rattle on a little bit. I mean, I'm just going to move through this very, very quickly. So in terms of why mediate when there is domestic abuse, I think in terms of this, my view is, as I say, there's lots of different variations of mediation that are available now, so you can adapt it. Mentioned just then about alternatives. Court is adversarial. It's going to be very expensive for them. It might put them in an even worse position, and it can be very traumatic, I think, in a court process, whereas mediation, you've got that flexibility to really adapt things. Third point on the slide there about empowerment, I think, again, Karen, you and I have talked about this before. I think this is a really big thing, actually, that mediation can offer people. Very often victims of abuse are feeling so disempowered in their lives because they've obviously been in that dynamic, and you can start to build that back through a mediation process. Got to be done cautiously and carefully, but of course. So again, there's a few points in there which I'm not going to go through, but generally sort of moving things forward for people, and can you actually make progress, I think is the big point there. Okay, Karen, I'm going to hand back over to you to talk a little bit about how people might be feeling as they're coming to mediation.
Yeah, so they will feel all of these things. They might even feel all of them in one session, you know, because it's a real emotional roller coaster. They might feel petrified of going into mediation to start off with. They might feel more hopeful once they've done a couple of sessions, and once they feel like they are making a bit of progress, they might start to feel quite excited about the future. This might be an opportunity where they can actually have their voice heard, where they can actually feel like they've got a bit of control back in their lives. They might feel quite confused. They might feel overwhelmed, you know, particularly if they're mediating around finances rather than children. So they're going to have all of these emotions. So as a mediator, I think you've just got to be really conscious of that and read that body language, and, you know, just be really mindful that this is huge for somebody that is not used to having any power or any control or any voice. So I just wanted to talk a little bit quickly about tactics of abuse. So an abuser will use all of these tactics. They will switch between tactics depending on what they think is going to work for them at that particular time. Oh,
right.
So, you know, they might agree to something. There might be that occasional indulgence. But then they might, you know, they might use humiliation or degradation. They might really kind of show their true colours and that display of power, you know, to show who's in charge. and who isn't. Exhaustion is a very common tactic that abusers use, that constant trivial demand. You know, they want this bit of information, that bit of information, and they want it now. And, you know, it's just constant. And again, it's just to exhaust and to confuse and to just make things that much more difficult. They will use lots of excuses to justify their behavior, why they haven't got information, why they can't put certain things on the Form E, etc. You will have heard it all, I'm sure. You know, they make excuses to minimize and justify their abusive behavior. So again, as a mediator, you've got to understand and listen out for those cues that says somebody's perhaps not being totally honest.
And I think, Karen, just to pick up on that, I think it's, again, a really important point actually to make, that abuse comes in so many different forms, and the clues aren't always someone shouting at each other or being nasty or horrible directly to someone. Some of these other things are so important to be looking out for as well.
Yeah. So the feedback. So I'm not going to go through all of these comments, but these comments were from some of my clients. I put a question out about mediation. What's your experience of mediating with an abuser? And this is some genuine feedback that came back from it. Now, lots of it is very negative because they feel very vulnerable. They feel very threatened. Some of it is determined by the mediator and their experience and how they handled the sessions. Some of them is, you know, some of their comments are related to how they felt they could cope in that moment. And sometimes it's positive as well. You know, sometimes they have felt really empowered standing up to the abuser for the first time. So it is a bit of a mixed bag. And I asked them for feedback on mediators as well. And again, it was a bit of a mixed bag. You know, some felt the mediator really had a good sense of who the abuser was. It was really able to handle them and handle the situation and really help the victim feel more empowered. And for other people, they felt like the mediator just didn't get it, and that they were just allowing the abuser to have that platform. And sometimes they use some tools and some different things that actually, you know, really worked, really helped the person that was the victim in that situation. So again, you know, it's about your experience, it's about how you handle the session, and it is about picking up on those clues from both parties, really.
I think, again, it's understanding that no two cases are going to be the same. So again, it comes back to building blocks, doing that screening, keeping it under constant review, and managing it, not sort of shying away from it. And I think if in doubt, get help with that and get some external help into that process as well. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how do we get it right then in mediation, because I think we've probably thrown a lot of information out there. There's a lot to think about, a lot of different things to be considering with this, and obviously we're short on time. I mean, we could probably talk about this for a day, let alone for an hour. So as I say, screening is key. I think absolutely, if there's one point to take from this, it's screening. Get your screening right. If you're currently a mediator, you've probably already got screening mechanisms in place. Revisit them, review them, run them past other people, really start perfecting that screening, I think is the key. Training on domestic abuse, obviously Karen offers various training on this as well, but some of the things that she was talking about there about the sort of high risk indicators, the dynamics of what's actually going to go on in abusive situations, and understanding that, I think being trained on that is really important. So taking those opportunities where you can. No blanket policy. I think, again, I hear a number of mediators sort of say, oh no, I won't do it if there's any issues with domestic abuse, or yeah, you can do anything even if there's domestic abuse. I think what I would say is don't take either of those approaches. I think having a blanket policy is generally not the right approach. I think personally, I think you can mediate if there are issues of domestic abuse, but I think you've got to be thinking that through very carefully, and whether you are the right person to take that on and what measures need to be in place. consider all the options. So again, as part of your screening process and the mining process, you should be doing this anyway. But I think, again, it comes back to that kind of holistic approach. What do these people actually need to help them? And that's both parties. So if there is alleged abuse, obviously you don't always just take that at face value. You've got to think through, as a mediator, you are there to assist both parties and to move everybody forward. What needs to happen in all of that, what resources, and so on. So as I say, think holistically, what actually is going to be best for the client. And I think, again, personally, as the mediator, I think we need to be a little bit more directive when we're doing our MIAMs and so on, not just sort of pushing it onto the client saying, got all these options, all these processes, you could do any one of hundreds of different routes these days to try and sort your issues out. We need to really be guiding them on that and just sort of think more broadly than just the mediation space. What else are they going to need going on for them? And as part of that, it's obviously then support. What support do they need? What can be put in place for them? What measures can we also put in place to give mediation the best possible chance of working? I think the way I quite often think about it is, if we do this, could this work? And I think that's generally quite a good starting point. And then acknowledging your successes when it goes well. I think, as I say, some people feel very uncomfortable doing this work. If you do it and it does go well, I think acknowledge that and build on that and sort of learn from it as you're going through it as well. Okay, I'm very conscious of time. What we wanted to do was just run the poll again to just explore whether there's been any shift in that. So Helen, hopefully you can still hear me. Could you just set up the poll to run that again, please? And if everyone could then answer, it's the same question. Should mediation take place when there is a history of domestic abuse? You've got the same options, which are yes, no, or unsure. So we just want to sort of see, out of interest, if there's been any movement in that. So I can see people answering that now, so thank you. And we'll give that a few moments just to see where that goes. Okay, just give it just a few more moments. We've got most people, I think, have answered there already. Still coming in, so just give it a couple more seconds. Yeah, I think, Helen, if you can close it down, conscious of time. Really interesting. So I think obviously we can see a jump from, I think it was 27% were saying yes previously, is now 51%. The no's has dropped from 11% to 5%, and unsure has dropped a bit down to 43%. And I think with the unsure probably feeds into that point of it depends, obviously on various things, which I think is probably the right answer actually in my view, Karen. I don't know if you've got any comment on that.
And I think, you know, traditionally, when we're looking at domestic abuse, as IDVAs, we would have always said, mediation is definitely a no-go area. But since I've been working in this field and dealing more with family courts and post-separation abuse, I can definitely see that mediation is an option, especially with the shuttle mediation and the hybrid mediation. People feel more empowered when they have control. And if they can be part of a process that gives them that sense of having a bit of control back in their lives, then, you know, it's got to be worth a go. It's got to be worth a chance sometimes. And if it doesn't work, at least they've tried, like we said. So,
yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we're just going to leave on the screen some top tips here. And I think I'm very conscious of time, Helen. I don't know how sort of strong a cut-off we've got at 2 o'clock, but we're just going to leave that on here. And sorry, just get that to I think just looking at the Q&A, see if there's any questions that we can pick out that might be worth discussing in the moments we've got left. What power imbalances do you need to be aware of? Karen, what would you say on that? So as a
what, sorry?
What power imbalances do you need to be aware of?
As in, I don't really understand the question, to be honest.
I think in terms of mediation, so the way I would see that is in terms of power imbalances. I think as a mediator, you're looking for, has someone got more power and therefore influence things more? And I think certainly as a mediator, I'll be looking at sort of financial power, whether it's that they're just more used to doing things. So again, someone might be used to doing online calls all day, and so they're very used to doing it if you're doing a remote mediation session, whereas someone might be not very tech savvy, might find it hard to log on, things like that. So there's all sorts of things again that go into that. Anything, Karen, in your mind that sort of jumps out when you're thinking power imbalances?
Well, a very obvious one is when somebody's trying to talk over the other person, when they're just trying to have their agenda and they're not willing to listen to anybody else's. And yeah, they're just not listening. They're just there and just kind of, spouting off what it is that they want. And where they are not really wanting to discuss the reasons behind it. It's just, this is what I want and that's that. Somebody that's very in control of the process, you get a sense of how somebody comes across with their body language. Even on a screen, you can tell the tone of their voice. It can be very obvious.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's absolutely right. There's another question there about the questions sort of pre-MIAM, I suppose, pre-meeting.
Yeah.
How would you suggest is best to ask them, whether it be by email or by phone? I must admit, as I've said before, I send out almost like a questionnaire. Karen, any thoughts on that you've got?
Yeah, you have to ask them what's the safest way to communicate. You should really be asking that to all potential clients before you know what their history is. What is the safest way to communicate with you? Because you don't really know what that person's situation is and what their circumstances are, or what the reason for their divorce is, and the reasons why they're coming to mediation. You might not necessarily know whether it's a return to mediation. They might have already been through court and come out of court and be going back into mediation. So I think just that general question about what is the safest way to communicate with you is just a simple thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to leave some of those top tips on the screen. We'll just do a couple more questions. I think we are able to overrun just slightly. Interesting question here. Would you add certain mental health issues as a high risk indicator?
Yes, if they have diagnosed mental health issues, that's the difference. So lots of people who are victims of domestic abuse will have some anxiety, depression, PTSD, perhaps, as a result of trauma. Okay, that doesn't necessarily discount them from being able to do mediation. As abusers, lots of abusers will claim to have mental health issues to excuse and minimize and justify their abusive behavior. They may have some anxiety, they may have some depression, they may have had suicidal ideation in the past, but it might be more based around power and control. It may not be a true mental health condition, such as a personality disorder or schizophrenia or bipolar, anything like that. So I think if they've got a diagnosed mental health history where they've been in hospital or they've been under a psychiatrist or that, then yes, yeah, that would be one.
That's right. I think it's got to be diagnosed, I think is
yeah.
my approach as well. Some questions here about third parties in the mediation process. So the first question is, do third parties supporting, e.g. a friend or a coach, actively participate in mediation? I suspect every mediator is slightly different on this. I think certainly, and there's a follow-up question here about surely both parties need to consent to that third party involvement. To answer that bit of it first, I suppose, is yes, they would need to consent. The way I would do that is any third party signs the agreement to mediate, and I would be explaining to them what mediation is all about and the sort of confidentiality of the process and so on. So I would be going through that. Generally, in my experience with third parties, they are perhaps slightly more passively involved in the process. They're there to support the participant. They're not there to sort of argue the case and so forth if it's a solicitor, or to really be making the decisions if it's a coach or a friend or anything like that. That being said, it's a flexible process. You're going to sort of have to strike the right balance in that. Usually, in my experience, and again, Karen, I know you've done some mediation work as well, where you've sat in, but in my experience, usually it's a shuttle set up and that person's doing the work with the other person in the room, whilst you as the mediator are then with the other party. I think that's the way it usually tends to work.
Yeah, or they can come and see me between sessions, and we do the work then around, you know, helping them figure out if it's a decision that they want to agree to or not agree to. Definitely, if it's financial mediation, I don't get involved because I don't understand finances. But it's more about, like you say, emotionally supporting them, just keeping them calm, helping them think things through, stopping them from panicking, and also encouraging them not to make decisions too hastily sometimes. You know, I can maybe sense that they are panicking and they're just saying, oh, I just want to get out of it. I just want to get this over with. So I'm just going to agree. But I suppose because of my experience with supporting clients of post-separation abuse, I know the pitfalls that can befall you if you agree to things too soon. So sometimes I would really encourage people not to just agree to things too quickly, to really think it through and really think about what that will mean for them long term.
Yeah, I think, again, it's that benefit. I think most mediators would say having third parties involved is only a good thing. Whatever the expertise, whether, again, it's a lawyer, whether it's a coach, whether it's whoever it might be, assisting in whatever way is required. And I think, again, there's a couple of questions here about the sort of coaching in between sessions and things like that. I think, to be clear, you as the mediator aren't doing that. You're bolting on the external support, which could be for someone like Karen, who's working with the individual party, not as part of the mediation process, although they may be coming then into the mediation sessions. That's external work, if you like, that's going on with just one party to the process. Okay.
And remember, what you see is kind of a snapshot, really. I may have been working with my client for, you know, I've had some of my clients for 5 years on and off, and they've been in and out of the court process, and they might have been to mediation once or twice. And, you know, so I've got a really good view of what they've already been through and what type of person their ex is, and, you know, what they can cope with and what else is going on in their lives as well. Because, you know, when I'm coaching, I'm not just looking at the legal stuff. I'm looking at everything. I'm looking at their parenting and, you know, the difficulties that their children are having, and, you know, their financial difficulties maybe, and their housing issues, and, you know, their support network. So there's a lot to be taken into consideration, really.
Yeah, no, I think that's it. And I think, I mean, I'm conscious of time, and we have got a hard stop in about a minute's time now. But I think, just to sort of mention, I think what I said before is there's a lot that goes with all of this. And I think for mediators, other professionals, it's about being informed. And I think there's some resources, some places to think about on the screen there. I've seen in the Q&A as well about MARDA, so Mediators and Domestic Abuse Network. Again, another thing to mention, another thing to reach out to and get involved with, or look at the resources there. So lots of places you can find more information. Unfortunately, we haven't got any more time for any more questions today. If you have got any further questions, by all means, feel free to email either Karen or myself. Our details are on the screen there. So if you want to reach out to us, then by all means, please do. I can see, I mean, we've got something like 40 questions in the Q&A, so we haven't managed to get through all of those, so apologies that we haven't had time for that. But thank you all for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk about this with you today, and really to conclude Family Mediation Week. So thank you. I hope you've all had a really good Family Mediation Week. I think it's been some fantastic resources going out and so forth. And enjoy the weekend when it finally arrives. So Karen, thank you very much for your time today, and we'll sign off there. Thank you.
Thank you.